No one's ever taught them how to deal with uncertainty. Well, if it's bad with board-certified physicians, it's a whole lot worse when you're dealing with people who aren't used to dealing with uncertainty. So here again, I want to show you some good ways to deal with uncertainty. Even Sherlock Holmes knew this, and he wasn't even real. Okay, now the criteria are coming, but just to keep you from, falling off the edge of your seat, I still want to lay a little foundation. It will make sense in just a few moments. There are a few important points here. These criteria are designed for experienced clinicians, senior, competent clinicians who know how to manage complex cases. I learned something when my parents got sick. My parents passed on at the age of 90-something about 5-10 years ago. And I realized that if you're 45 or 60 and you get sick, the average specialist in internal medicine is fine. If you are 80-something, if you are 80-something and you have 6 medical problems, it far exceeds the expertise of even many of the best attendings in Boston. And what attendings mean, senior doctors. I was, oh my God, what are you doing? People who were seeing my parents with me would say, what would have happened if you weren't there? They would have died. Okay, so this is complicated stuff. You cannot put this in the hands of a junior clinician or someone who never does it and expect a good result, any more than you should expect an intern to do well in the intensive care unit without supervision. Another thing I want to stress is what I'm about to show you for criteria do not replace clinical judgment. They help us, what's wrong with me? They help us to inform clinical judgment, and you still need to be using good judgment and the scientific method. There's a saying among lawyers that, bad judgment isn't negligence. Well, the only way that's true is if it's the standard of care to use bad judgment. Okay, so let's get more specific. What does the clinician need to understand? This is the consciousness raising part. If everyone is nodding that they're familiar with this, great. If you're not, these are the 3 things I look at. One of them is to know how to properly weight and combine evidence to either rule in or rule out what you think is going on, the diagnosis of other finding. Another thing is to know something about conditional probability, which basically means the probability of one thing given another thing. The probability the child is alienated given that he is rejecting extended family, or the probability that the child is estranged given the fact that the child displays all 8 manifestations. By the way, the answer to that second question is very low probability, okay? But this can be quantified. Now, we've often been attacked, probably everyone in this room, for not having enough quantitative evidence with numbers attached to it. The work is just qualitative. Well, if you're a clinician, you should be able to quantify why you are coming up with your decisions based on the laws of probability. I'm not saying you have to do it in several decimal places, but at least give me a high, medium, low probability for some of this, and I can show, if I had the time, that most people, most mental health professionals were really not trained to do that. A third thing, and final one, that I really want to focus on is, is to do a proper causation analysis. How many people have ever taken a formal course on how to do a causation analysis in the room? If you don't put your hand up, we won't hold it against you, but how many have had a formal course? Okay, I'm seeing about 6 hands in a room of maybe 60 or 70 people. So, I used to have boards in disability medicine, and causation was everything. If it was an injury at work, you had to show it was work-related. I had days and days of training on how to do causation analysis. Why is that relevant? Because when we're deciding whether a child, an aligned child, is alienated on one hand or estranged on the other, that's a causation analysis. And when we're deciding whether it's a hybrid case where you have both alienation and estrangement, that's a causation analysis. And in the United States, in all 50 states, there are laws that say that a straw that broke the camel's back is not sufficient to establish causation, at least not in a workers' comp case. Workers' compensation is an insurance plan in the United States for work-related illnesses and injuries. And until about 1990, the system was going bankrupt Because if someone who'd had 10 back surgeries sneezed at work and said, ouch, my back hurts, that straw that allegedly broke the camel's back was enough to get full compensation. So the government stepped in and said no. Now, why is that relevant? Because people who believe that every case is a hybrid don't know how to do a causation analysis. It's so clear to me, I don't even consider it an opinion. Recently, a well-known expert testified that in several hundred cases, that person had only seen 1 or 2 cases of pure alienation. The only way that could be true is if you think the slightest straw, the slightest negative behavior by the targeted parent is enough to say, there's his contribution, it's a hybrid. Well, you can't do that, it's wrong. And if someone gets mad at me for that, I think I'd be happy to debate them. One last thing, the criteria I'm going to show you do not necessarily give definitive answers. They tell what to believe in light of the evidence we have at hand. That's pretty much all we can ever do. You know, in the old days we didn't have DNA, and now we're letting people out of jail because the DNA clears them. But at least we can make the proper use of the evidence that we have. In order to do that, and this is the closest I'll come to math, this is something called Bayes' theorem. It's the simplest form. It's simple odds. And I'm going to talk you through it, but it'll only take a minute. I would suggest if you're interested, Google it. And the reason most people don't know much about it is it's usually taught in its algebraic form with a complicated equation and symbolic logic that only someone who knows it would know. But it's really ridiculously simple. If you want to find the odds of anything, we take the prior odds of that thing and we multiply it by the evidence, and we can express the evidence in odds. I have a wonderful example. Sometime around 7, 8 years ago, someone reported that they had found particles traveling faster than the speed of light. Someone at CERN, neutrinos, and I was with a group of professionals when I heard that, and I instantly said, no way. What are you, a physicist? No, I'm not a physicist. No way. You don't overcome 100 and something years of science because some guy takes the measurement and thinks they're traveling 0.1% faster than the speed of light. It's got to be a measurement error. But the reason I was virtually positive is this simple equation. You know, the prior odds of Einstein being wrong are so low that one guy's or one group's, flimsy evidence doesn't overcome it. It doesn't, we have a saying, with enough evidence you can swamp the prior. Well, that's not enough evidence, and you know what? Dad yelling once at Johnny is not enough to swamp the prior odds that the child is alienated, because children virtually never reject a parent in the absence of an alienator. So again, I'm just trying to give you the flavor for how this can be useful. I'm not really trying to teach it. One last thing I want to say, I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. This doesn't necessarily give you a final answer. It tells you the most rational and logical thing to believe in light of the evidence. And you keep updating that evidence. If someone comes in with new evidence, a video of dad beating the crap out of the boy, well, that's very important. But absent that, this lets us quantify, at least in round numbers, what's going on. Now, I'm not going to talk about this. Don't get nervous. Poor Dr. Burnett took a look at this slide and ran up and said, don't talk about it. All I want to say is that the model I'm going to show you thought of these things. Sensitivity is the pickup rate, the detection rate. Specificity is a measure of the false positive rate. It's really 100 minus that. And these things can be combined into things called likelihood ratios, which are ratios. This one, for example, would be the ratio of true positives over false positives, positive likelihood ratio. Why is this worth hearing? Answer. Because you don't want to dichotomize this. I've personally seen several dozen times psychologists testifying in these cases who say something like this. The boy can't be alienated. Why not? Because he could say something good about his mom. I mean, in my office, I asked if he could say anything good about his mom, and he said she's not a bad cook. Yeah, but he also said he hates her, and he just, he loathes her. In that psychologist's world, That was not a lack of ambiguity, because there was a little ambiguity there. Okay? That's not how it's done. If something's dark gray, it's pretty close to being black, and we don't need absolute certainty. Okay. Now, as far as the criteria go, they're extremely simple and I think elegant. There are only 6 of them, and it's very similar to Amy Baker's 4-factor model. In fact, I'll explain them by explaining the differences. First of all, there's 2 for each member of the triangulation, or the triangle. 2 for the child. Oops, I was trying so hard not to do that. 2 for the child, 2 for the favored parent, and 2 for the rejected parent. So keep in mind that that's a total of 6, because if all 6 are present, here's where I'm going with this. If all 6 are present, and we give them that weight of evidence called the likelihood ratio, we get a probability as to how likely it is. And those numbers are mind-boggling if you know how to do them. And the people who are arguing this point clearly don't know how to do them. And by the way, if your cardiologist or your oncologist didn't understand how to do them, people would be dropping like flies in a snowstorm. This is mainstream clinical reasoning in medicine. Mainstream, required of medical students. Okay, now, expanding slightly, the child criteria, the first one is basically going to be looking for, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. For the first one, we have mild, moderate, severe. And it's sort of a version of the 8 manifestations. It's the child's rejecting the parent for trivial reasons, to oversimplify, okay? And the second one, and I'm going to show you this more clearly in a moment, but the second one is looking for evidence of pathological splitting. As Dr. Burnett told you this morning, looking for splitting in these kids is a highly specific indicator and very reliable, very valid. Okay, for the favored parent, the first criteria is really looking at Amy Baker's 17 behaviors or strategies. And those have been well validated. And the second of the parent criteria is looking for significant intentional misrepresentations to authority figures. Now, we're not talking about someone who, gained 10 pounds and is lying about it. We're talking about, no, I never struck little Johnny, and there's a investigation that shows that you did. That, significant things. Moving along to the rejected parent criteria, or the disfavored parent. As Amy Baker explained this morning, we're looking for the absence of clinically significant abuse or neglect, and I like to throw in, or markedly deficient parenting skills, but it has to be severe, or at least clinically significant. I do want to stress the phrase clinically significant. And then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're looking at lying as an indication in the favored parent, and if the favored parent is lying, what direction does that point? Toward alienation or toward estrangement? Toward alienation, right? So there's a double negative here that I'll get to. I'm just using this to set it up so that I won't lose you in a few minutes with the actual slides for this. But if the rejected parent is not lying, that points in the direction of alienation as well. Okay, so it's all very logical if you think about it. Now let me expand. So the child criteria are taken from the 8 manifestations that we all know about. In fact, I start by showing them to you. But when I saw this for the first time, which was many years ago, it occurred to me that these are really just 2 things. They're not independent variables. Several of them are examples of splitting. In fact, if you combine the first 2, why are you denigrating mom or dad for trivial reasons? Mom's perfect, dad's rotten. That's splitting right there. Lack of ambivalence, kind of splitting. Reflexive support, kind of splitting. Rejection of friends and extended family, kind of related to splitting. And then some of the others are related to language. Borrowed scenarios, we all know what that is. Independent thinker. No one told me to say this, okay? So what I've done is distilled these down into 2 easier to use criteria. Now, they don't replace this. This is great. You can still go to court and talk about the 8 manifestations. But if you want to do this mathematically, you need something called conditional independence. Simply put, you can't count the same thing twice. So if I say, oh look, there's a lack of ambivalence. Let me give that a score. And oh, there's also reflexive support. Now it's even worse. No, you can't do that. That's the same thing. You can't count it twice. So the first child criteria is a combination of the popular 8 manifestations, Gardner's definition, along with borrowed language, bad phrase for me to use just there, from Kelly and Johnston and that group of people. They like to talk about the child's behavior as disproportionate. So I'll read it to you quickly. This is criterion 1 for the child. The child manifests unreasonable negative beliefs, feelings, and or behaviors about the rejected parent that are significantly disproportionate to the child's actual experience with that parent, and there's a pattern of denigration for which the child provides weak, trivial, frivolous, or absurd reasons. There's a sophistication here I want to point out but not dwell on. Many people have peer-reviewed this, at least 20 of some of the best people in the world. And a lot of people started out saying, well, you didn't mention campaign of denigration. A lot of that language had to be removed, because what if it's not a campaign? What if Johnny has nothing good to say about mom, but the therapist says, well, I wouldn't call it a campaign. So certain things increase specificity and decrease sensitivity to get fancy. So this was gone over with a fine-tooth comb to take out pitfalls like that. It's deliberate, and I think it increases the validity and the reliability. Okay, so now splitting this into 3 parts, we have 3 levels of that first criterion, which is basically, rejecting the parent for no good reason. You can just think of it as that. But let's get a little finer in our analysis with mild, moderate, severe. So if all they have is the basic definition, we're saying that's level A. If clearly it's pathological, it's kind of hard for me to picture it not being pathological, but some people could disagree, and that's fine, that's reasonable. So the level B is clearly pathological splitting, and level C is not only do you have the splitting, but cruel, unkind, hateful behavior, absence of guilt, intuitively, like, this is even worse. Now, why bother to do that? Answer, when I assign values mathematically, whether I call it 2, 4, 6, and 8, I like to be able to distinguish the kid who, just says, I don't like mom, she's not a good cook, from the kid who says, I wish mom would die and I wouldn't give a damn. And we need some way to capture that information, so this helps us to do that. All right, for the second criterion for the child, again, use of language. It captures the borrowed scenarios and independent thinker. And to put a finer point on it here, look for language that is not only borrowed but not age appropriate. One of my favorite examples is a 9-year-old from Linda Gottlieb's cases, a 9-year-old who would let grandma hug him because that would be violating my personal boundaries. My favorite example is a 7-year-old who heard her older sister called dad a liar, and the 7-year-old, when asked her opinion, said lies upon lies upon lies. All right. So those kids have been indoctrinated and manipulated at least. All right, so there it is. Those are the 2 criteria: elegance, simplicity, and I left out something that I think I'm glad I left out, but I want to throw it in now. One of the rages nowadays in medicine, checking my time, still okay. One of the important things going on is something called clinical decision rules. And they strip things down to the most essential elements. They don't say, let's think of all the possible reasons a child could reject a parent. It could be this, it could be that. Reasons none of us have ever seen, in fact. Okay, that's just not how it's done. So these are meant to be stripped down, and they're not giving you a final answer, but they're helping you to weight the most important evidence. All right, so for the favorite parent, we start the First criterion, as I said earlier, is 17 strategies. It's impressive when you have many of them, but even one or two that are being aggressively used would be clinically significant. Amy herself distilled them down to 5, and I made it a 6, so I can never remember 17, can you? But if you look at this list, this is a manageable list of 6 that captures all 17 in categories. I'll just let you read that, saves a little time. But, so we're looking for those. Here's how it's worded. If the wording is the least important thing. Favorite parent without a valid reason, either consciously or unconsciously, has exhibited one or more of these behaviors. Notice that I don't care if it's unconscious. It's rarely unconscious in my experience. But every therapist who writes, oh, I think he's doing it, but it's unconscious, that doesn't matter. If you're burning your child with a lighter fluid, the fact that you did it 10 times unconsciously or something doesn't impress me. Anyway, moving on. So this too has mild, moderate, and severe. Finally, the favorite parent criteria. Amy Baker gave you the evidence of this morning. By the way, so did every other speaker in some way. Basically, we're looking for absence of bad behavior. Oh, sorry, I can't see as well as I should from here. I'm still on favorite parent criteria. The second one is the lying, as I mentioned earlier. Significant lies. Now, someone criticized that in a recent talk I gave and said, mental health professionals are not trained to detect lying, and it's not admissible in court. And we have a very prominent attorney by the name of Ashish Joshi in the audience who gave me a one-word description of that comment. Ashish, are you here? Can you yell out real loud what you said about that in one word?
Hogwash.
Hogwash. All right. It's utter nonsense. How about if the court has found that mom was lying, or that Child Protective Services has investigated and found that there were 100 false allegations of abuse and neglect? There may be a little gray zone where we have to be careful, but the idea that lying doesn't count is, I hope that person's not a forensic specialist. Okay, moving along. The rejected parent, it's basically absence of the bad stuff. No bona fide abuse, no clinically significant neglect. They're not horrible parents. You don't lose your kid for getting a C in parenting. You lose your kid for getting an F. And the second criteria, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If they're both lying, mathematically it becomes a wash. But if one's lying and the other's not, that has forensic significance, and it sure as heck has scientific significance. All right, so one of the things that this requires us to do is to reason backwards. And I collect custody evaluations that make elementary errors in clinical reasoning. I now have several dozen. One of my favorite was to claim that if you didn't actually witness the behavior, then you cannot infer that anything happened. And that, even Sherlock Holmes knew that was not true. This is from the very first Sherlock Holmes story in 1887. In solving a problem of this sort, the grand thing is to be able to reason backward. That is a very useful accomplishment and a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. In case anyone doesn't know, Holmes was based on a real physician, Joseph Bell. We get Bell's palsy. The author, Conan Doyle, was a practicing physician, and Dr. Watson, the fictitious sidekick, was a physician. This was well understood in medicine in the 1880s. That's the point I want to make. There's nothing controversial about it. Another good one I like. Watson, you as a medical man are continually gaining light as to the tendency of a child by the study of the parents. Don't you see that the converse is equally valid? I have frequently gained my first real insight into the character of parents by studying their children. 1892. So again, there's no excuse for a judge or a lawyer or anyone else to claim that if I didn't actually see it, then we can't assume anything. You can't infer a lot of things. Judges understand this. They'll tell juries that, if you look at your mailbox at noon and it's empty, and you look 5 minutes later and it's full, probably the mailman came. Scientists understand this because that's how we discovered Neptune. Uranus was doing things it shouldn't do, and we realized that there's probably another planet's gravity affecting it. just as we can assume that if a child's doing weird things that you would only expect if there's an influence from an alienator, then it's scientifically valid to draw inferences. Now I'm going to, just to make sure I finish on time, I'm going to make short work of this. But the model I'm giving you does have a few assumptions. It assumes that the numbers you put on the weight of evidence are reasonably accurate. To assure that, I surveyed about 40 different mental health professionals, first a group of 22 and then another 18 or so over the years. I assigned numbers that I don't want you to really look at carefully, but for each of the criteria, we gave it a likelihood ratio. If, you know, the first child, for example, is between 15 and 21. The language one for the child is 8. This means that if you only had that one piece of information, you would multiply whatever your prior odds were by 8. Now, the reason I don't want you to waste too much time on that is if you don't like my numbers, you can substitute numbers that are ludicrously low. And, for example, 3. And that's called doing a sensitivity analysis. Let's see how sensitive this model is to the assumptions. What if instead of using Dr. Miller's assumption that it's 8 or 15 or whatever, we just use a low number, 2 or 3. So if one parent's lying, I'm going to say, oh, let's call that 3 to 1 in favor of alienation. Or if the kid has borrowed scenarios, let's call them all 3. And when you do that, you find that even when you start out with very low odds, 5% would be 19 to 1, and the kid, or family, I should say, family has all 6 of these criteria, you're still dealing with 97% probability. So you started believing the evidence was way against you at 5%, and you wound up with all 6 of these, and the very low assumption of only 3, and you're still at 97. So this is almost overkill. Now, what I want to jump ahead and just show you a couple of things from a real family. And then I think I'm going to stop. Using my numbers, which I believe to be not only plausible and realistic, but on the low end. Remember, I'm combining the 8 child criteria into only 2. So you would expect them to have a lot of strength and power and validity. You know, so let me tell you what you're looking at. Let's assume that you don't believe in alienation, or in this particular family, you think the odds are only 1% that this could be PA. Well, trust me, if you do the math using my numbers, you know, you've got CC1 at just the A level, the weaker, and you've got the favorite parent at just the A level, the weaker, and all that. You're at 99.5, essentially, for a probability of alienation. And this doesn't do justice. So what I do in the next slide is I expand it to say, well, what if your assumption wasn't the 1%, which you see over here, but what if that, which is 1 in 100, what if it was 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 1,000? And again, using, if the family has all 6, with 1 in 1,000 odds against you, you're still at a 95% probability of alienation. And if you start believing that it's 1 in 10,000, you're still more likely than not at 2/3. All right? So this has tremendous power. The next couple of slides just show you what if they were at the C level. Okay, so here, notice that's C. And there, you're at 99.96. And if you look at it expanded, even when you believe that odds were 1 to 100,000 against you, they're still probably alienated. This has tremendous, this should be giving people clinical and mathematical insights, okay? You really can't start out with a prior probability of 1 in 100,000 and then decide that you're going to believe the kid. Let me end on this note. Okay, here's the take-home point. If you don't like my numbers and you put in much lower numbers, my numbers, which are realistic, based on expert consensus from 3 dozen specialists, not experts, specialists, my numbers are probably on the low side. And they're weighted against it. So if you even use your 3 and the kid has all 6 of these, you're still, at 99 point something, right? So you don't, scientifically, it's really not okay to say, but I really believe that child. I don't think the kid would lie to me, and I interviewed him, and I think he's a very mature child who knows what he wants, and I'm going to listen to his voice. You can't ignore this much evidence based on your alleged interview skills. If anyone has such good skills, I'd like to meet that person, because I've never met such a person. Thank you, I'm done.
All right. Okay. Don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. Dr. Miller went through this very quickly. Very quickly. The point here is there's a base rate. There's a base rate of this phenomenon in the population in general. And if you have this, how likely is it that you got that? It's just about if you've got this, how likely is it that you got that? And what Dr. Miller is telling us is that this is all about how likely is it that you got this terrible phenomenon. And since the consequences are so dramatic, what we really are talking about is how likely is it that this phenomena is present. And as you can see by this analysis, and these slides will be available, will they not, Dr. Miller?
They will.
As you can see by this analysis, if you just take some time with it, you can get away from all sorts of other things and just say, look, how likely is it that this is alienation? And if it's more likely than not, because alienation is so blooming serious, we've got to do something. That's what we're talking about. Okay? So, you can do this. You do not need to be a math expert. Mate, come up here and get your mic on, and I'm going to talk about you.